Hey there, welcome everybody to Decisions Lunch and Learn. Um, this is where you can come ask any kind of questions that you've got, and well, usually decision-specific questions, but I'm open to answering any kind of question. I'll do my best to answer it, and we've got Monday through Wednesday this week, right at noon Eastern time. Of course, Thursday is Thanksgiving, so we won't be doing Lunch and Learn on Thursday. Please plan accordingly. If you have a question, the way that you can get it answered is by using the Zoom raise hand feature. So you can click that button and we can unmute you. You can ask your question through Zoom, or if you'd rather, you can use the chat or the question and answer box on Zoom as well. You can just type your question, I'll read through it and do my best to come up with an answer for you. So with that, of course, feel free to click the raise hand button if you've got any questions, and we'll unmute you. Okay, I've got a question coming in through the chat, and it says, we have a flow that will fetch the three entity records and will be called dozens of times per second. Said entities change once per hour. Does it make sense to use the cache outcomes option on the fetch entities step in this example? Short answer to that is yeah, I think it would. I do have a follow-up question. It looks like you're unmuted, so you might be able to answer this. Is how important is it that when those entities do update that once per hour, how immediately do they need to be updated in that flow that's fetching them?
I'm still sorting that out. I'm looking at, I don't know if I want it to happen within a few minutes or within 30 seconds. I'm still sort of debating that specific threshold. The competing concerns are, several minutes would get me, I think, more value from the cached result. As in terms of the efficiency it would offer, but I think that's long enough that when someone were to fix a configuration setting, for example, they want to see it in less than a minute rather than 3 minutes. That's just the way people are. So I'm still haven't really settled on a exact time for it.
Gotcha. So it sounds like, the preference, of course, as usual, would be that immediately after those things change, the flow gets the new values and operates based off of that. Of course, if you do that cache outcome, it asks for how long you want to cache it. And if you set it for, I believe the way it works is you set it for like, a number of hours or something like that, right? Let me take a look. Outcomes, cache outcomes. I'm taking a look on my screen. Yeah, so you set a time span. Is it exactly once per hour? Like, is it on the hour that those are expected to change, or is that just a rough, like, it might happen once per hour?
Well, glibly the reason for once per hour, and it's not going to be truly once per hour. It's probably going to be sort of the game plan looks to be about every 50 minutes. Fiddle with the tokens in this case, and that will introduce a new token, and that should be 10 minutes ahead of the expiration of the current token. And so then the fetch entity would just, so if I can get that within 10, so if I get that token that quickly, then I should have 10 minutes to switch over. It is sort of where that's coming from. Now, one of the things that prompts this question is I thought the fetch entities itself is reading from an internal memory cache, which then prompts the question, does it make sense to do a cache result on this step if there is also behind this thing a memory cache, right? And I think that because, for example, there is a fast fetch option that I've seen on the same step, fetch entities, right?
Yep, fast fetch.
And it's checked by default, which tells me that, and what I remember reading in a document somewhere that says it doesn't, but when fast fetch is checked, it will take the entity straight from the memory cache without checking if there's been an update, right?
I believe that is correct.
So I didn't see you put this here, so I don't know that that was on by default. It's one of the
It
things that,
was. Yeah, I didn't check that. That was just by default. Those always come checked.
well, okay, that's a different story point. Let's not go down that road. But I mean, what prompts this specific question is the part of, okay, if I'm caching this output, how is that different than what I believe there is a memory cache, a memory, you know, larger memory piece under the hood that I'm supposed to pretend isn't there, but actually is there, right?
That is correct. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one way of thinking about it. Is it's supposed to just do some of that for you, a little bit of optimization, but you don't know exactly how it's going to do that. So
So I mean, the cache outcome result, as it were, makes a lot of sense for a lot of different steps, and for even, and especially for some for your subflows in some cases, right? But then I look at this fetch entity step. I think it has the cache feature just because that's part of the part of the framework thing, right? I mean, it would be more trouble to take it away, I expect, than to actually keep it here. But then that prompts the question, well, am I really going to buy anything by actually asking, I'm saying I'm going to be going through this fetch many times a second. Does it actually buy me something to cache it? To use this option down here.
I believe what this option gets you is control over how it's caching. So if you set this to none, as you've pointed out already, it's going to do a fast fetch. It's reading from memory. But with this configuration, when you set it to none, you don't really have any control over when is it actually going to refresh, when is it going to check the database again. When you set this to global or per user, you can set that time span at least. So then you can control, okay, I know in this case, every 5 minutes, it will check the database and it will get any updated entity through there.
Okay, so this is exposing what is a default behavior. And that default behavior, based on my experience, seems to have a default with fast fetch implied, it seems to have a default of about an hour or so, which
I don't,
is,
yeah, I don't know what the default is. And that's partly why, I would, if I wanted to specify, I would use this, the cache outcome option. Hour probably sounds about right. Is that what you're kind of seeing when you test it? Like you've run the fetch entity step and update that record, then run it again and wait until you see it actually update or get the updated value.
I don't think it's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be more to it. And when I say that because one of the previous problems we had like many months ago, we were having trouble with my QA tester reports that when she changed a record, when she went back to it, she sees the old data, the prior results, but on the reports, she sees she sees what she put in there. And then I verify the database actually does have what change she made, but when she brings up the same thing in a form, she gets because she gets the prior result, which told me that, well, okay, we're getting stale data from a cache somewhere, and I don't know why. And that's how that, we started chasing our tail there, as it were.
Gotcha. And in
But
that,
that was a long time ago.
okay, but that particular setup, that was using a fetch entity step.
I honestly don't remember if it was a fetch entity. I think there was a fetch entity step, but I also think there was a the entity generated get step in play, and I forget. And so the details as to which was which is kind of foggy to me. But I do remember having a support ticket in for it and kind of going through, okay, what do we do about this? Um, and like I say, that the specific details of that in particular escape me.
Gotcha.
But I do think that one of the things that we started to do, which is why I think it may be the fetch entity step, is that we started to uncheck fast fetch.
And then you would always pull from the database. You should, if you have fast fetched unchecked, my understanding is, or my assumption really is just that it should pull from the database every time. It'll write a new query, you'll get whatever values currently in the database.
There somewhere, I don't know where I saw it, and this might be, I think I may have put in a trouble ticket asking, well, then what is fast fetch? And I think the answer was not that it always pulls from the database. Okay, so this is where things start getting really murky. We're kind of digging into this black box, right? But the answer, what I was told is that when there is a fast fetch, that prior to when taking data from the cache, there is a point where it stops to ask the question, is my current value, does my checksum match this other checksum? And if the answer is wrong, go to database. If the answer is not a match, go to database. So there's this match, no match check. And when you have a fast fetch going on, you skip the match, no match test, which means that if the memory piece that is like we know is there, does get out of step with the database, which is what happened to me at least once. In terms of when does one catch up to the other, is then its own mystery. In that we would notice that maybe after an hour or so, eventually that it would drop out of the cache, and then when the next time you ask for it, it reads the database. That was our best assumption as to what's going on. But I was told that it's not necessarily a direct, okay, I'm going to get this from the database. It's a let me ask the question. Are we dirty? And if the answer is we're dirty, then then you go to database.
That sounds right. I don't have that insight into the back end of how that works either. But okay, here's a I'm going to propose a completely different solution that you can either take it or leave it. It just kind of popped in my head. We do have a set of cache steps. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly which ones we do have, so I'm going to go to the documentation site and look. But the reason this might be a good option is it could take away all of that ambiguity that you're up against right now. You've got these entities that you're fetching a lot, and you really want it to behave in a particular way in terms of caching, and the fetch entity step is just too generic to handle that. What you could do is instead of updating the value of an entity with, I don't know, however that's being updated, maybe an entity action, instead you could update the value of something in cache. And then I know, at least in general, the way the cache steps work is there's a put value into cache and there's a retrieve it from the cache. So there's different types of cache, of course, which you could see on this document and how they work. But that would take out all of the ambiguity and it would let you set it up exactly how you want it to behave. I think that if you use these cache steps, you'll be able to get the best of both worlds. You should be able to have it pull from memory when you want it to, and then as soon as the update, it should pull updated values. That way, there's no time in between when that value is updated and when the flows actually operate based off of that new value.
So the put step is going to replace an existing value. Is that how that is?
I think that's how it works. So my experience with using the cache steps is that it's a key value cache. So you would have some key, when you use a step to update the value in the cache, you'll just use that same key. The fetch steps would fetch by that key as well. It would essentially replace that entity that you're using. You may use both. Really, you could have an entity that stores that value in the database and then use in the same entity action. I'm assuming you're using an entity action to update that entity. you could use cache steps to put that value in the cache as well. The only downside to cache is, if the server goes down for whatever reason, if it's restarted, those values won't be in memory, and you'd have to have a flow that can add them in there automatically.
Yeah, I mean the cache step, as you say, takes away the ambiguity, but then you have the responsibility for loading the cache and maintaining it as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. There's pros and cons to using this approach. That's why I just want to throw it out there as an option. You can completely control how it works in terms of when things are in memory versus when they're updated, things like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The downside to that is you have then the responsibility of what you may need to even do for to make sure that your system always works is you could set up a scheduled job flow that runs on the server startup to fetch that entity and then enter that value into cache. A bit more work, but it does get you that desired behavior.
The things so the name value pair for your cache, does this show actually the step to put the value in? Is that so? There's this, so that I guess we're down here at yeah. Does this show the configuration of a put into cache?
Let's see. So we've got a step. I think first you can set up the cache itself, like you could you define it.
Yeah, I think
It
you first
depends
have
on
to
the kind of
define that.
cache. Just a name and then I guess a description. I don't know what fill cache using flow is. That might be a way to have it. I'm not even gonna make a guess as to that, but for the actual put in cache step, you give it that instance name. The key and the value is what you'd be looking for. You could come up with your own key. You'd always use the same key for whatever value, and then the value is just some string.
So something that stands out to me is that my value is a string as opposed to anything else. So that would have to, unless the cache type offers me to use a complex record. I don't know
Find
how.
out. Yeah. We may be able to just, instead of doing a string, it looked like there was a drop down with the type. Let me just pick some entity. I'm going to do a case entity. Yeah, so if you select, yeah, it looks like, you could set that to be your actual entity type too. I've just picked some case entity that I created a while back, and it looks like it's asking for now that as the input for the value. So that could keep your full entity in memory, and you just have control over when it gets updated.
Well, something to consider.
I imagine this would be some rework.
Well,
Worth considering.
yeah, it's I'm sort of at the kind of trudging through the immediate parts of yeah, I need to get a new one every hour, and then I need to kind of stick it in front of the consumers. So I'm still basically in the early parts of putting that together.
Gotcha. In the meantime, I mean, the simplest solution, of course, is just to use this fetch entity step, set the cache time to something less than what you're looking for. And I imagine you said you're fetching it, several times, dozens of times per second. It would only, if you set that cache time to 5 minutes, which means, at most you're gonna have a 5-minute delay of when that entity is updated to when it's updated in the database to when that flow is respecting that. Every 5 minutes, you might notice a slight slowdown, but it should only be very minor for one individual who's doing that fetching. Everybody else will be able to get it from cache.
Right.
So as a placeholder, that kind of pattern should work fine with only, minimal performance hit.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. I don't see any other hands raised at this point, and no other questions in the chat. I'll give everybody some time to think through it. If you've got questions, feel free to hit the raise hand button or enter it into the chat. And like I said, I'll do my best to give you an answer. Don't see any hands raised. No questions coming through. I'm going to continue giving you all just some time in case you're thinking through what you're going to ask. One thing I wanted to do while wasting time on these lunch and learns or waiting for questions is to I wanted to start building out a project completely from scratch, and I wanted to make it a pretty simple project, but completely go through and on the fly decide how I was going to build it out. The project I decided I wanted to do was it's one of the, or at least when I started at Decisions, it's one of the first projects that you are assigned to do and build in Decisions, and it is to make a calculator app. And when you first start, the easiest way to do that is instead of actually like showing a picture of a calculator on a form, you would just have a form with a text input and maybe a drop down for the operation you want to do, like plus, minus, multiply, divide. I wanted to revamp that. I wanted to go back and actually rebuild that project, but make the form look like an actual calculator. I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that, and that's partly why I wanted to use that as this project, because it might be fun to watch, watch me struggle through that. So you can get an idea for how I would think about stuff. But yeah, I'm going to start building that out now while we're waiting for questions, and you can feel free to interrupt at any point with anything that comes up. So calculator project. I've got nothing in this folder. I've got nothing in my brain so far about how I'm going to put this together. But, I usually like to start with data structures when it comes to building out a project. For this particular calculator, I can't think of any. I'm not worried about database storing anything or anything like that. So the data structures are going to be a really simple thing here. Honestly, I probably would start with none at all. And maybe if it becomes useful to me, I would create a flow structure that can hold all the values on that calculator form itself. But honestly, to start, I don't even think that's going to be necessary. So with this, the next thing I'd probably do is just, I want to create the form, but what I want to do, since that form might take a bit, I want to have a button for every number that you could select and every operation that you could do. Before I even get that far, I just want to do a quick proof of concept, or I don't know if a prototype is the right word here, to make sure that the way I'm actually going to do this calculation on the calculator will work. So I'm just going to call this test calculation logic. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to represent or mimic kind of what I'm expecting the data flow on that calculator to do. So how could I actually have the calculator run this logic? I have an idea. I'm just going to say math string as the input. What I want to have this calculator do is work just like the those very basic like 4-function calculators that you would have used in like elementary school. Just so you can get an idea, I'm gonna pull a picture of one of those calculators. I want it to work basically like this would. So, you'd show the numbers up at the top. I may even show like instead of just the single number, I might show the full, 1 plus 2 up at the top, and then you'd hit equals and it'll show the result. But yeah, this is kind of what I'm thinking. A way I can think that would do this is a evaluate expression step. I'm not even sure that's what it's called. Here we go. Evaluate expression, but that's a constant. So I need to be able to pass that in. Evaluate dynamic expression. Okay. So this step takes in a string, and it might be able to do all the math that this calculator needs to do, especially if I keep it simple. Here's how I'm going to test it. I'm just going to pass in my math string and run it in the debugger. And for example, I would pass it something like 1 plus 1. And I would expect that to give me 2. Okay, so that's good. I know that the calculator is going to have what else? Oh, it gets complicated with the percent. I don't know, and the square root. But to start, I'm going to keep it simple and just assume, if I pass it 1 star 1, is that what it's looking for multiplication? That was a terrible test because that wouldn't actually tell me anything. Let me do 2 star 2, so that way I know. Actually, that's not great either. I'm gonna do 2 star 6. I should get 12. Okay, cool. I am curious just to know if this would work with an X, because I think that would look better in the actual calculator. And no, it doesn't. So if I wanted to show an X to like 2x6 for 2 times 6, I'd have to just transform that string before running it in this step. But to start, I'll just use a star. I also want to figure out what division would look like in here. I guess it's just a slash. Excellent. Okay. So I know that this may be a viable solution, at least for the majority of the kinds of operations you do with a calculator. It makes me feel comfortable pushing forward and actually building a form that relies on something like this, because that form is going to take a bit of time. I wanted to make sure before I do that, I'm not wasting my time even building something that would never work. So, all right, I'm going to take a look at this form. Okay, I'm going to call it calculator form. And I kind of want it to be about the same size as what that Texas Instruments 108 would be, the classic elementary school blue calculator, the nice plastic case. Those are good calculators. It looks like, it's definitely taller than it is wide. So I'm going to give it maybe 500 pixels of width. That's even still too much. Let me give it 300. That looks closer. And I want to get the ratio about right. So the height needs to be a little bit shorter. Actually, instead of making the height shorter, I'm going to make it wider, and we can scale this up and down if we needed. That's a little too wide. Always have a really hard time telling. Let me take another look at this. This is still too tall. Or it's not wide enough. However you want to look at that. All right, that's close enough, at least for how I want this to look. I don't need these grids that came with the default form. By the way, if you're just joining in, I'm just building out a simple calculator app. And if you have any questions, of course, you can feel free to hit the raise hand button, type it out in the chat, and I'll stop what I'm doing to answer your question, which is definitely going to be more important. When I put together a form, I always think it's really important to rename things. mostly because if you go to the Explorer and you see things that, there's 6 grid layouts, that can be really difficult to actually use. And more importantly, now with the new, what do we call it, active form flows, those take in every component that's on the form and use those names that you set up for your components, which means if you've got grid layout, you don't really know how to map something into your form, or if it just says text box, you don't know which text box it is. And by the time you've mapped something in, if you're going to go update that name, you've got to update your active form flow. To me, I realized it's just important. You might as well name these things immediately. It doesn't take too long. I usually try to go with some sort of naming convention. So by default, if you drag out a text box, I'll have to do that in the toolbox. Drag out a text box, it asks for a name. Let's call it some box for now. The convention that it uses is the name of the component, and then in brackets, your name, and then in brackets, the name of the component. I kind of like that. So that's generally what I stick with. Either that, or I'll do the name dash the type of component. One interesting thing I've seen with this particular naming convention is that if you look at the Explorer, it uses that naming convention. But what's kind of interesting is, if I called this grid layout, like let me call it base grid, and then in parentheses grid layout, it doesn't duplicate that name. So that's partly why I like this, is because it doesn't look too bad. Anyway, so I'm gonna go ahead and actually put together this grid. And of course, I'm keeping an eye on the incoming questions in case there's anything that comes in. Base grid is a good name for this. And in general, I always use this advanced editor. I just find it a little bit simpler to use. I'm looking at a picture of the calculator on my other screen here, trying to decide what this needs to look like. I'm gonna need a big top bar for the for that screen. So I'm gonna give that maybe 50. There's a little solar input there. I don't think that this calculator is gonna need that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just have a blank space there, but I'm gonna leave room just in case if I wanted to put, if I wanted to style this and make it look just like that calculator, I'd have room there to do that. Under that, I'm going to have a bunch of rows for the buttons. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows for buttons. I'm going to give each of them maybe 20. And then there's a tiny little chin at the bottom of it, and that maybe would take about 10 pixels. So 20 is a little bit small, obviously. They're going to have to be a lot bigger than that. Why did I think 20 would work? Oh, you know what it is? I don't have any of resizable rows, so that's not exactly accurate. Let me see what it looks like. No, that's pretty spot on. I was thinking 20 because usually, 30 is what I'd use as a default text box height. I wanted it to be a little bit shorter, but let me go ahead and just bump this up to 50 for each one. Like I said, there were 6 of them. That looks a little better. But I do want to have the top be a little bit larger, 75 and 75. Okay. I might make this shorter in a bit. Column-wise, so this calculator has these buttons pretty close together. There's 3 columns there, and then a space, and then all of your operator buttons there. That's pretty good. That's pretty good design. It really separates the buttons from the operation buttons. It really kind of makes those stand out. I like that one to mimic that. So I'm gonna have 3 rows, a space row, and then a 4th row. And that should be all I need. Actually, you know what I need to do? I'm gonna make this a separate grid. I think that those buttons don't need to be on the base grid. So I'm getting rid of this whole space here, and I'm gonna replace it with a wildcard sized row. And in that row, I'm gonna put another grid, just to keep it a little bit more organized. So I got 75, 75, the space for my buttons, and then a 10, and then another 1 star. I don't need that other 1 star. Cool. All right, dragging out another grid layout for the buttons there. Gonna go ahead and name that, and I'm gonna keep the exact same name that I used for the other one. There's no space in there. I think I'm gonna put all of the buttons in here. It's 2 T's and buttons. All right. This, like I said, this is gonna have 4 rows, and there's gonna be 5 columns, and one of them is a spacer column. So that one's gonna be a little bit less wide. I don't know. I'm gonna go with 50. Gosh, I always get it wrong on the first try. 3 rows of buttons, and then a spacer row, and then 50 again. Right, and of course I need 1 star. You know what? The wild card is great for when you resize things. You can control what gets larger and what doesn't. In this case, I don't want someone to resize the calculator. I want this to be a very fixed form, because you can't really take a calculator and stretch it out. I want this to mimic the real life calculator. I think it's too wide though, because these buttons are going to be really narrow. Here's that space column. I don't know if I want to make the buttons wider, or if I want to make the form less wide. I'm going to start with wider buttons. I think that's going to look all right. Row wise, we've got, I think I said it was 5 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 6 rows. These can all just be 1 star because they're all the same height. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I need 1 more. Okay, so I wanted these to look more like rectangles because that's how they look on the actual calculator. Right now they kind of look like squares. So either I can make the whole form a little bit shorter. I think that's what I'm going to do. It still looks a little wonky. I think it'll look better once I get get some actual buttons on there. I'll be able to make it look a little bit better. I do want to have a gap. I'm going to use this this gutters setting here to put a gap between each of the buttons, because otherwise you just have a ton of buttons that are way too close together. Let me put a couple of buttons on there just so I can have sort of a reference of what it's going to look like. I'm using event buttons here, by the way, because I don't want this to actually be outcome pass from the form. I just want a way to click a button and trigger some data flow to run. Actually, sorry, active form flow, because that's what I'm going to use here. Version 7, I'm a big fan of the active form flows. They have made form flows so much easier for me because I don't have to do any mapping into those. Pretty much every component that's on your form will become an input to your flow automatically, and you don't actually have to map anything from the form into your data flow. Now it's just all right there, which has been great. Anyway, so I want to be able to trigger one of those flows just by clicking a button. I don't want the form to disappear and come back. That would be one way to do that. But instead, I want it just, you click it and then I can run a flow. That's what event buttons are for. It's literally, they just create a trigger for those flows. All right, so with those on there, I don't know, I'm gonna give it like a gap of 5. That looks all right. I think it might be a little bit, I don't know, that might be right. Let me see what that looks like with the column. That's pretty close. I think that looks good. I think overall the buttons are too big still, but we'll get to that later. Up at the top, I want to put another grid in this cell. This is gonna hold the actual like screen for the calculator. I'm gonna call it calculator screen and then go with my naming scheme. I actually don't love this naming scheme. It's kind of a pain because you gotta type out grid layout every time and put those brackets. It's pretty picky. I might go with something easier in the future. I think the only thing that matters really is consistency. As long as pick some scheme that you like and stick with it throughout an entire project. In this case, I'm going to stick with the one that I already started. So this one's going to have a one. I'm just going to have a border around what I actually am putting in this. So I'm going to have 2 columns of 1 star surrounding my actual text box. So I think this thing is going to take up most of the width of this form, which I think was 400. So I'm going to say this is 350. And then as far as the rows go, this thing, it's got a somewhat of a tall screen. I don't know. I'm going to give that 50 and see how that looks. That's pretty close. I don't like the scroll bars, but I don't think those will actually be there when the form is rendered. I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to use a text box for the screen of this calculator. And I'm going to call it calculator screen. Oh, I need an outcome scenario, right? Because otherwise it's going to give me this validation warning everywhere. And these raise event buttons are not, those don't count because they don't actually have an outcome path. I don't know that this calculator is actually necessarily really going to need an outcome path button. You know what it is? It's the on. On is going to do it. There's an on button in the corner there. So I'll use that as an actual outcome path button. Oh, wait, no, it's on/clear. So that won't, well, you know what? That'll work. That'll work even better because then I don't have to have a flow to clear it. I'll just have an outcome path from this form and route back to the calculator form, and then I'll clear the calculator. And that just has the added benefit of getting rid of that validation warning. I don't want this screen to be editable. I'm going to just disable it now because I don't want folks to be able to type in there and do the calculator that way. I want people to have to click the button. On second thought, I'm not gonna disable that. If you couldn't tell, I've not planned this out at all. I'm not gonna disable it yet, just because that way it'll be easier to test. I'll be able to pull up this form and type stuff if I need. I will disable it in the final version of this calculator though. I'm gonna set up this row now. I'm gonna put another grid just below the grid that I've got for the screen. Not a responsive grid, a regular old grid layout. Now I kind of feel like I accidentally grabbed a responsive grid for something else. No, I don't think I did. Okay. And what am I calling this? This is where I'm just going to put some label stuff. Static labels. Yep, that's how you spell labels. Okay. Looking at this calculator, I don't know if I'm going to mimic this exactly. You know what, for now, maybe I'll come back and add this little solar panel thing. I don't know about that. But I do like this label here, and then the TI-108 looks pretty nice to me. For now, I'm just gonna have one column, and I'll leave it at 2 rows. I'm just gonna throw a label in there. Decisions instruments. There we go. You know, one pro of going with this naming scheme is it automatically does it for things that let you type in a data name. I do like that. That is a pro of going with that naming convention, for sure. Okay, so we've got most of our grid layout set up. I've got about 10 minutes left on this call. What do I want to get done in that 10 minutes? You know what I want to do? I want to make it so that if I click a button, I can actually see a number show up in this screen. I don't know if I'll be able to do that in 10 minutes, but I'm going to give it a shot. All I want to do is make it so that when I click this button, and it's going to say, this is just going to be the number 1. That's where the 1 key goes. I want it so that when I click that, the number 1 shows up in my screen. Okay. So I've got my event button. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to open up another tab. Oh, and I'm going to save this one because anytime I'm doing work, I want to make sure it doesn't disappear. So I'm going to hit save. Oh, and by the way, 10 minutes is enough time for me to answer a question. If anybody does have any questions that come up, I'm more than happy to pause this calculator and answer one of your questions instead. But if I don't see any hands or any questions come through, my goal is I'm going to hit this. I'm going to be able to click this button, and the number 1 will appear up in this text box. I mean, that's pretty simple, but you know, I got 10 minutes. So I want to make sure I can do that. I'm going to do it with the new fancy active form flows, but I still am in a habit of always creating subflows first before, you know, actually creating that as a flow on the form. So what I would do is, I think that without having thought through this that much, I think that this flow is going to be responsible for pretty much all of the screen updates of the calculator, not just for the number 1, but well, no, I think this flow may only add the number 1 because I want a specific flow to run whenever I click a button. I want it to always put the number 1, and I think I would need a flow to do that. I could have one flow that, like, depending on the button that was clicked, put that number in, but I'm not sure exactly how that's going to look. But you know what? We'll keep it simple for now, and I'm just going to have this display the number 1. Display 1 on screen. We'll keep it really simple so I don't hurt my brain. The input to this is, well, really, I don't need any inputs because technically, you know, if you put in the number 1, if you click 1, it's always 1. I can always show that. But I think it ahead a little bit. I'm not just going to put 1 on the screen. I'll put 1 plus whatever was already on the screen. Not plus. I shouldn't say plus. That's bad language because I'm talking about a calculator here. I would do 1 concatenated with whatever is on that screen. So I need current screen coming in as a string. And as an output, I like to think through inputs and outputs of flows before I actually do anything in the flow. So outcoming from this flow is just going to be new screen. And updated screen, I don't know. I don't know if I like that name. Updated screen. Okay. All that really has to happen here, at least for this simple flow, is that concatenation that I talked about. I could do a plain text merge. That'd be very easy, because then I could just drag out both the current screen, or the number 1, and then the current screen. I'm going to look and see if we've got any specific steps for that. And they would be, if there were any, it would be under data and then text. That's where pretty much everything in terms of, text manipulation is list concat. That would do the trick. But it's a list of 2 items that might be overkill. I could see a lot of these are going to come in handy, I think, for later on in this calculator. I'm just going to go with plain text merge. Merge to plain string. Now I could do a plain text merge right on the output here. That is a mapping type, obviously. And if you do that, I get the same editor that I'm going to get with this step. Now, the reason I'm going to actually use this step here is just for usability of this flow, like readability, maintainability. Someone else coming in won't have to just see a completely empty flow. They'll understand, okay, more easily. They can look at this at a glance and understand what it's doing. So sometimes it's very handy to be able to do text merges in your mapping. I think in some cases, it's best to drag out a step to make that flow just a little bit more readable. Okay, so when you type the number 1 on a calculator, usually you expect that thing to, you would expect the 1 to show up after everything that's currently on the screen. So I'm going to do current screen and then 1. And since those are probably going to be a lot of numbers, I'm not going to add any spaces. It's just going to put them right together. I'm going to rename this step. When I name steps, I like to indicate what it's doing, as well as what the step is. This icon is a little generic. That kind of shows up for a lot of text manipulation steps. So I would like to have merge plain string in the name. I'm just going to say concatenate 1. And then I like to put a dash and then the actual step name. And now we've got a pretty clear idea of what's happening. Although concatenate 1 is not great. It's not my best work, but I'll take it. Updated screen. That is the output of this step. Now I just need to map it into the end. Cool. Just to make sure I'm not going crazy, let's say I had, I'm going to debug this and make sure it's working. If I already had the number 4 on the screen and then I pressed 1, I would expect 41 to be the output. Okay, great. So I can expect my calculator to work with the number 1. Very simple flow. Now I'm going to use that with the actual active form flow. I'm going to call this 1 button. I'll probably have a bunch of active form flows with similar names: 1 button, 2 button, equals button, things like that. And this again, this is why naming your components on your form is very important. When things are just called event button 1 through 5, it's kind of hard to tell what it is. This is a little better because 1 is actually what's on that button. So I know that when I click this button, I want this form flow to run. Doesn't need to run at startup. I will say is blocking. I probably don't need it to run on those outcomes. So All right, at this point, I can edit the rule flow. It's going to give me the new active form flow designer. I mean, it's just the form designer, but by default in here, we've got form data. And like I said, this is every component that's on there, including buttons, everything like that. For example, if I wanted to look at the screen, where did I put that? Calculator screen, you've got certain properties of that component, which is really nice, like whether or not it's enabled, what the initial value was, and its current value. What's neat is if you change the values of these properties, it'll actually impact what that component's doing. So if I, set visible to false on the screen, it'll make the screen go away in this flow. It's very, very convenient. I don't know if everybody's seen that before, but it's one of my new favorite features for version 7. All right, so I created that subflow to do most of the work. I'll say display one on screen. That's the name of the flow. Now that I'm thinking about it, that's a pretty bad flow name because that's not really what it's doing. It's going to display one and whatever was on there. Maybe I'll go back and fix that later. I probably won't. That's a lie. Whenever I say I'm going to go back and fix something later, I don't. That's why I have to do it right the first time. Okay, so it's looking for the current screen, and that's going to be in my form data. And I'm going to map it in from the screen and value. I think, let's see, enabled validation issues visible. Okay, value is not showing up for some reason. I'm sure there's a good reason for that. It does not look like I'm going to be able to get my goal done of having this update. I've got 2 minutes. That is a bummer. Thank you, Sabrina. Sabrina's giving me encouraging notes here saying I could probably do it. But I can't even remember what I was doing. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to route around the subflow, and I'm going to just do the I'm going to do the step that lets me update those values. So in the toolbox, form rules, set control value is the step that lets me update the value of some control. Looking for a control, my form data, I'm going to take in the full object for the screen, and it's looking for a value. And to make it really simple on myself, I'm just going to have it so that it just puts the value of 1 there every time. You can call that another proof of concept to make sure that works. Okay. Oh, there's a validation issue in the flow. That's because I have the subflow in there. I get rid of that. I'm probably going to go over by a minute to make this work. You obviously can feel free to drop off. You don't have to stick around, but if you want to see that number 1 show up on the screen, stick with me real quick. All right, so I think the calculator is all set up and ready to go. I just need a flow that'll actually run the calculator for me. Put the form into the flow. And I'm going to set the screen up by default. It's going to show nothing on the screen, so I'll set that to ignore. If I hit debug, it'll show me my calculator with these great buttons. If I hit 1, boom, we've got 1 on the screen. I'm going to call that a win. I kind of skipped a bunch because if I hit 1 again, it's not going to add another one. It's just going to replace that with the 1. But join me next time. If there's no questions, I'm going to come back to this calculator and I'm going to just keep working on it. Hopefully we'll get somewhere really slowly but surely. I'm probably not going to touch this until the next lunch and learn. But anyways, thank you for joining me. I hope you have a good Thanksgiving week. I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Matt.